Today is Sunday, December 18th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Yesterday, the news got around on social media that Father Frank Pavone, who has become widely known for his activity in the pro-life movement, and I believe he was the founder of the group Priests for Life. Well, he was dismissed from the priesthood by the Vatican, by the hierarchy of the Church. And so in Father Pavone, or I should now say Mr. Pavone, we have another example of a priest rising up and opposing the bishop, or a number of bishops, and eventually being dismissed from the priesthood. We've had a number of these high-profile priests in the news over the past few years, and we see that Pavone is another one. What's unfortunate about these situations today is that these priests who get on social media and gather around themselves something of a rabid fan base, when their priests are exposed and are disciplined by the hierarchy of the Church, these priests encourage their fans and supporters to follow them in opposition to the hierarchy of the Church. And ultimately, this is what reveals the real evil of these priests and why Christ drives them out from his priesthood. They're not true shepherds. And these fans of these celebrity priests are ready to fight against the bishops and popes as if their celebrity priest has some kind of direct connection to Christ that doesn't go through the hierarchy of the Church, or some authority in the Church that isn't derived from Christ through the hierarchy. After all, if the call to the priesthood is something that a man can get without the Pope and bishops, why go to seminary? Why seek ordination? Why not just call yourself a priest? It's because there's no such thing as a priest separated from the Pope and bishops. And so we have another priest dismissed from the priesthood because of this overwhelming snare of social media, internet, television, political celebrity status. Another one bites the dust, as it were. Now, what's even more bizarre, and this is sort of like an onion in that the levels of bizarreness just go on and on. When these things happen, when one of these misguided celebrity priests chooses to rebel against the authorities of the Church, we often hear this line quoted by all of his admirers, which says, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. You're a priest forever. They can't take that away from you. You're a priest forever. So even though this priest, Frank Pavone, was stripped of his priestly role, his followers, his fans, will go around quoting this line from the scriptures to suggest that it doesn't matter what the Pope and bishops do because he is Christ's true priest and they can't take that away from him. And of course, this is just foolishness. This is like the devil quoting scripture to Jesus. If we read the Baltimore Catechism, which explains this, what it says is that there are some sacraments which can be received only one time. And they can only be received one time because they make an indelible mark on the soul. One of these is baptism. So when a person is baptized, he's baptized forever. He never needs to be baptized again. Once baptized, always baptized. Holy orders works the same way. When a man is ordained to the priesthood, that ordination is forever. The man's soul is marked by the sacrament of holy orders, and through that sacrament, he gains access to spiritual benefits that are available to no one else, but only those who are ordained. And that mark placed upon his soul by the sacrament remains with him for eternity. For eternity. Now this idea of this indelible mark of holy orders is what the fans of these priests have in mind when they suggest that once a man is ordained, that ordination can never be taken away from him. And as far as this is concerned with this mark upon the soul of a man, it's true. He is marked as a priest forever. But this is not to be confused with his permission to exercise the office of a Catholic priest when that permission is removed from him by the hierarchy of the church. And so we have an ugly situation because we have a man whose soul bears the mark of holy orders and yet who has been stripped of the actual duties of that office. And that's what we have in Frank Pavone and others like him. So this idea of this indelible mark of the sacrament is not an honor to him, but it's a sign of disgrace. It's not something that he can cling to and trust in as he rebels against the Pope and Bishop. It's something that is going to haunt him if he doesn't repent. It's something that's going to earn for him more severe punishment if he were to leave the faith. And it's something that he has to respond to and deal with in the right way. And so this indelible mark of the sacrament in his life is like the mark of baptism on the soul of a man raised in the Catholic Church and baptized a Catholic who chooses to abandon the faith and dies as an apostate. He goes to judgment not only as an apostate, not only as an unbeliever, but he goes to judgment as an unbeliever who, when he stands before Christ, will have the mark of baptism on his soul. And that's just a terrifying thought. There will be souls in hell for eternity who bear the mark of saving baptism, because that grace was given to them by God through their parents, and they despised it, just like Esau despised his birthright in the Old Testament. So when we talk about this "you are a priest forever" idea and the sacrament of holy orders in the Catholic Church, it doesn't mean in any way that Frank Pavone has a right to act like a priest even if the Pope and bishops choose to strip him of that office. It has nothing to do with his activity in the Church or any activity of his done in the name of Christ, all of which depends on the authority of his superiors. It simply refers to the indelible mark made upon his soul by the sacrament, which does in fact remain with him, but now it does so as a sign of shame and not honor. Some of these fans of his will imagine that he has entered into the shared experiences of men like John Bosco and Padre Pio, who were also priests who at some point in their ministry had their faculties suspended. They'll say, "Don't worry, Father Frank, you're just like Padre Pio," or "you're just like St. John Bosco. Don't worry about what Pope Francis says. You're just like one of the saints." Well, that is entirely false, because Frank Pavone and his situation is nothing like the situation from the life of Padre Pio or John Bosco. It's exactly the opposite. Both John Bosco and Padre Pio were misunderstood at the time by their immediate superiors, by their bishops or by their superiors within their religious communities. And because of the radical nature of their lives and ministries, their immediate superiors, those who actually worked with them at the local level, for some reason or another, often because of false accusations or simply, miraculous activities, that, news that miracles were being performed that their superiors felt needed to be investigated before all kinds of craziness broke out, they chose to suspend their faculties and not allow them to continue ministering publicly. Now, in those situations, in the lives of the saints, the local superior suspended their priestly privileges, and appeal was made to a higher authority. When the appeal was made to the higher authority overruled the local superior and sided with the saints. The Pope sided with John Bosco, and the Pope sided with Padre Pio. And they were both, by order of the Pope, restored to their priestly work. The local authority did his job. He made a decision based on his understanding, exercising his authority. An appeal was made to a higher authority. The higher authority reviewed the case and made a judgment. And in their cases, in the lives of these saints, the higher authority sided with the saint. In Frank Pavone's case, the opposite happened. Frank Pavone got into trouble with his local superior and then appealed to higher authorities, and the higher authorities confirmed the judgment of his superior. Frank Pavone's situation is nothing like that of Padre Pio or John Bosco. So those comparisons need to stop. Now, what the problem really is with Frank Pavone and these other priests who have been, quote unquote, canceled lately, and they're sort of forming like a little posse of these canceled priests, followed around by all of their flattering internet followers. What these men have in common is that they look at their role as priests as a mean to some other end, some end that they consider more important. There was a priest a year or so ago who got into all kinds of trouble fighting about COVID lockdowns and vaccines and things like that. And he was disciplined by the church, rebelled and spoke out against the bishops, and was eventually dismissed from his priestly office. I don't even remember his name. That's how vain these things are. So he had his pet issue that he used his priesthood to promote. Others have done the same with the Latin Mass, choosing to disobey bishops or object to bishops' instructions, even to the instructions of the Pope himself, and use their priesthood as a way to promote a certain idea of culture that they're interested in. And they have done so in disobedience to the hierarchy of the church. And in Frank Pavone's case, it was the pro-life movement, this whole political action organization that he organized, Priests for Life. It turned out that when all was said and done, he was much more concerned about his political activity than about his role as a priest in the Catholic Church. His zeal for political action blinded him to the reality of his vocation as a priest, who promised at his ordination obedience to his superiors. And again, the difference between the saints and Frank Pavone is that when the saints were told to stand down, they did so. They obeyed. They followed the normal, approved courses of action within the church. They trusted God for God's will to be done through the hierarchy of the church, and in the end they were vindicated. They never led people against the bishop. If you remember, if you've watched video renditions of the life of Padre Pio, you'll remember a scene where one of Padre Pio's friends, a layman, began to speak critically of the bishop, and Padre Pio actually slapped him across the face. That's the difference between the saints who endured difficult times as priests with regard to disapproval of superiors and Frank Pavone. Padre Pio and John Bosco submitted to the church in obedience. They never spoke against their superiors, but entrusted their cases to God. And when I say they entrusted them to God, I mean they entrusted them to the hierarchy of the church. They accepted the judgment of the hierarchy of the church. But these canceled priests, they always seem to have some cause that they're championing, and they see the priesthood as a means of promoting their cause. And this gets them into trouble, gets them turned upside down, especially when these priests are not bound with any kind of vows of poverty. So they're allowed to make money and run these nonprofit organizations and do all kinds of things outside of their promised priestly duties. They just become these wandering mavericks, these conference speakers, traveling ministers. And it's really confusing because that's not what priests are. Priests are ordained as assistants or ministers to the bishop. The bishop is the pastor. Your bishop where you live is your pastor. He's your shepherd. That's the office of a bishop. The priest is a minister who assists the bishop. The people in the congregation are the sheep of the bishop. They are not the sheep of the priest. The priest, everything that he does is delegated to him by the bishop through the sacrament of holy orders. And the bishop has the authority to take away those privileges anytime he judges it to be necessary. The priest has no right, no claim to the activities of the priesthood without the approval of his bishop. This is why when the Latin Mass gets shut down in a particular place because the bishop judges it to be a source of trouble, everybody goes crazy like the bishop has no right to do this. But the bishop has every right to do this. He's the pastor. He's the pastor. He's the head of the church locally. He has every right to do that. Every priest ministers because he's permitted to do so by his bishop. And what we see in these priests is that they just sort of get wrapped up with their celebrity status, and they imagine that because they have more internet followers or more YouTube subscribers or because they make more money, that this sort of gives them some exalted status in the church. And what's so beautiful about the church is the church doesn't care one bit about this stuff. The church doesn't care how much money they're making. The church doesn't care how popular they are, because they're really not popular. The popularity of these priests is is deceptive because it's sort of a global internet attention that they receive. It's not actually a popularity that relates to their actual place in the church. You can have people in Australia who subscribe to the YouTube channel run by Frank Pavone, and Frank Pavone has nothing to do with Australia. He's a priest. And so we find these strange, deceiving situations because of the internet, because we have access to a global audience. And it presents an unrealistic appearance of popularity because it's distributed over the whole globe. I can give, my own example of this. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, in order for me to teach the classical liberal arts the way I want to teach it, without any compromise or dilution, I don't want to dilute the classical Catholic curriculum, and I would have to do so in order to organize and run a local school, because there's no way that I could find a body of students in any local place, any geographical location to actually have a classical Catholic school. The studies are of interest to a small number of Catholic families. I don't believe that there would ever be sufficient local interest in a classical Catholic school, a real classical Catholic school, to try to build a school in any location. So going online with education, using the internet to connect families all over the world, we can have a significant student body, because we can draw selected students from the entire globe, and we can have several thousand students working together, studying the classical liberal arts. And when we're online, it looks like a significant following. But when we divide the number of students or the number of subscribers or followers, when we divide that number by the actual size of the audience from which that number is being taken, we see that it's statistically zero. So if I have, let's say, 2,000 students in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, someone can say, wow, that's a great number of students. And it would be if I had a school with 2,000 students, let's say in Charlotte, North Carolina. It'd be an enormous private school. But the Classical Liberal Arts Academy has, let's say, 2,000 students out of billions of people on earth, meaning the Classical Liberal Arts Academy serves relatively zero human beings. Now that's the way I think about it. I appreciate the opportunity that working online gives me to teach the true classical Catholic education to a significant number of students. But at the same time, I understand that statistically, what I'm doing is completely irrelevant on a global scale and is only important in the lives of these individual students and families that I work with. Now, that's not to say that it's not a significant achievement to even gain the attention that I have. Let's say on my YouTube channel, where I post videos on classical education and things like that, I think I have like 2,000 subscribers. There are other YouTube channels that have tens of millions of subscribers. And people can look at those numbers and say, this guy over here has 500,000 subscribers. You only have 2,000 subscribers. Well, It's actually very difficult to get 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, and you're comparing a few channels on the entire internet as if they're the standards. And there are lots of reasons why some of those channels have the attention they have, and often it's not good. Some of them have attention because they've simply done controversial things to get attention. Or they simply cater to the desires of ungodly people. When you think that I'm going to offer a sober, carefully thinking, classical Catholic education channel on YouTube, I'm sorry to tell you, but we're not going to have crowds that look like, Beatlemania chasing me around. It's not popular stuff. And yet, to have 2,000 subscribers is actually a significant achievement, because all of these numbers are relevant. I mean, not relevant. All of these numbers are relative. And it's hard for people to keep these relative numbers in view or in perspective. So some of these priests, they start to get a following on the internet, and they sort of lose track of reality. They imagine that they're much more popular than they are because they have some significant activity on their social media channels or in their email or their YouTube channels or whatever. They get a lot of attention, and they begin to think that they're far more important than they actually are. And this internet fame gets to their head and makes them think that, the numbers of subscribers they have or the amounts of the donations they receive is some kind of divine confirmation of their ministry, as if it's some sort of alternative to miraculous works, as some kind of manifestation of God's approval of what they're doing. And it has nothing to do with any such approval. The only approval that exists is that of the hierarchy of the church. And that's true for work that I do as a teacher who works with Catholic students, just as it is for any priest. If my bishop called me and said, "I'd like you to close the Classical Liberal Arts Academy," I would do so. That'd be the end of it. I'd find something else to do. But in my situation, it was the opposite. Before I even started the academy, I requested permission from the bishop and received it. But like I said, if the bishop changed his mind and decided that the Classical Liberal Arts Academy didn't represent what he wanted to promote, I would submit to that decision. And that would be that. But these priests and many others like them, these other internet people who talk against the hierarchy of the church, they're in the same ship lost at sea, who just forget the reality of what Catholicism is. They get wrapped up or deceived by this false appearance of popularity, not considering the relative insignificance of these numbers or any money that they receive. And somehow they imagine that they have some kind of divine right, some kind of direct divine approval for what they're doing, and they thumb their nose at the Pope and bishops. And that's what Frank Pavone chose to do, and he's no longer a Catholic priest. It gives us a good lesson as Catholics because it warns us. It warns us about allowing our hearts to deceive us. It warns us not to get all wrapped up in temporal affairs. Remember, the mission of the Catholic laity, I feel like I mention this in every talk I publish. The mission of the Catholic laity is to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. We have to learn what God's will is and then work to direct temporal affairs to that end. God's will is never for laymen or anyone in the church to work against the judgment of the Pope and bishops. So there can be no justification of any kind, no moral appeal, no theological justification for any activity that goes against the will and judgment of the hierarchy of the church. That's the ultimate silencer, the leveler, as it were. You can think whatever you want. You can think any issue is of extreme importance and urgency. But if the hierarchy of the church disagrees and judges otherwise, as a Catholic, you have to learn to stop and submit. Because this I fear God and not men attitude is just misdirected. And we're misquoting these biblical passages without respecting the context of things that are said and done. You have no way of knowing that what you're doing is God's will or is not God's will unless it can be proven to agree with the judgment of the magisterium of the Catholic Church. And that magisterium resides in people. It resides in the actual living members of the hierarchy of the church. It's not found in people who have certain degrees, who have had certain studies, who have some kind of earthly positions or titles in the world. This is no Anglican church where the king is recognized as having authority in ecclesiastical affairs. This isn't some kind of aristocracy where the wealthiest men make the decisions. The church is governed by a hierarchy of ordained men who can trace their ordination in an unbroken succession back to Jesus Christ himself. And these are not disputable issues. Our private causes, our private interests, our private pet issues are never the chief thing. They're never the main thing. The church is always the main thing, and the church is governed by living men who hold offices that they have received from an unbroken succession of ordinations that began with Jesus Christ himself and continues under the authority of Jesus Christ himself. When we see priests headed in this direction, or anyone else, anyone, could be a school principal, could be a teacher, could be some online speaker, conference speaker, author. When we see people with their face set against the hierarchy of the church, contradicting their superiors, we have two things to do. First, to warn them to cut it out, because they're in the wrong path. No matter what they say, they're wrong. And secondly, to get away from them as fast as we can. We're supposed to be behind the Pope and bishops. And if anyone is pulling on our sleeve or whispering in our ear or calling our attention in any other direction, we're to keep away from those people. We don't have to listen to their arguments or get into debates with them or have these endless wrangling discussions about different subjects. Our discernment is very simple, because staying in the church, staying with the church, and the church is a living church, not a church of our imagination from some period in the past that we didn't personally experience, but the living church in which God chose to place us. Anything that turns us away from the church is very easily discerned to be false. Now, the problem that makes people vulnerable to these different priests is that they get themselves wrapped up in these issues which Catholics are not supposed to be wrapped up in. They get themselves wrapped up in these issues that the hierarchy of the church is not itself wrapped up in. And rather than following the church where the church leads, they tend to get out of balance and run ahead of the church. And they get all invested and wrapped up in these different movements and activities and groups. And then they learn that this group or this activity really doesn't have the support of the hierarchy, and because they're so invested in this activity, so emotionally invested, maybe financially invested, they get angry at the hierarchy of the church and then begin to listen to these false shepherds who begin to draw them to himself away from the Pope and bishops of the church. And they fall for it and they start following. And these people often lead them right out of the church itself. This is what happened with Protestants following Martin Luther back in the 1500s. It's what happened with Arians following one maverick bishop who didn't represent the judgment of the Bishop of Rome and bishops in union with him. This has happened again and again through church history. All of these abuse cases we read about are almost always caused by Catholics getting wrapped up in local priests in a way that they're not supposed to be wrapped up with local priests. And I don't mean any pun by the phrase wrapped up. I mean, when we learn about these situations, we ask, why are kids spending time alone with priests in the first place? Where are their parents? How do these situations even develop? The situation itself should never even exist. It's no surprise when bad things result. And it's because of these unhealthy, unnecessary relationships between Catholics and individual priests. I've been in my parish for 17 years now. And our current parish priest, he's probably been here, I don't even know, 7, 8, 9 years or so. I hardly know him at all. He's a sacramental minister. I have no need or interest in any kind of personal relationship with him. What I need from him is what the sacraments offer, and I respect him as the minister of those sacraments. I don't try to make relationships with the priests. I don't think that's a good idea. My relationship with him is sacramental. I go to him to receive the Eucharist. I go to him to receive baptism for my children. I go to him to receive absolution through confession. I don't want a personal relationship with my priest. My relationship to him is sacramental, and I think it's good to keep it that way. I think saints would approve of what I said there. And we have to always wonder, why do Catholics try to develop personal relationships with priests? Why do we have Catholics who sort of tail around following their priests, often flattering them and trying to develop personal relationships? If you'd like to explore that, I recommend you read Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, because he talks about the faults of beginners in the spiritual life and why they try to develop personal relationships with their priests. If I said it, people would go nuts and call me a jerk. So I'll say, if you'd like to know the answer, go read St. John of the Cross. He's a doctor of the church. But anytime we get this little celebrity cult around a priest, we should know that something's not right. When we find people spending lots of time with a priest, something's out of whack. And most of the time, these things develop into problems, whether it's problems within a parish, and there's like fights and divisions in a parish, different cliques fighting about things, or whether there's these abuse situations where priests are able to develop relationships with parishioners that they shouldn't even have in the first place, or whether it's these other issues like political issues or liturgical issues, and there's just all of this intimacy between priests and Catholics, organizing and uniting together to form some kind of team that's ready to take on not only their political opponents or people outside the church, but even the Pope and bishops themselves. They just lose all sense of reality and go crazy because of these groups that they organize and these missions they undertake. And this is what happened to Frank Pavone. And it will happen to someone else who will step up and take his place and do the same thing and attract the same kind of people and end up in the same trouble. So that's the news from this week, and it's a good warning to us, like I said. It's a warning to keep our eyes fixed as far as church life is concerned. To keep our eyes focused on our priest insofar as he stands between us and our bishop insofar as he stands between us and the Pope insofar as he stands between us and our Lord. And to keep all of these in line, in focus before our eyes, and understand that there's no other way to be a Catholic as a layman that doesn't maintain this line of focus to our priest, to our bishop, to the Pope, to our Lord. And if any of these ministers were to ever get out of that line, we would know that something is wrong. Now, I don't know how long this talk has been. I'm not sure. Let me check real quick. It's about 51 minutes. Just to give an illustration of this last point that I made about having these officers in the church aligned. Imagine that you were going to put up a fence. Maybe you have put up a fence. Out on the farm, we have to do fence work all the time. And you learn all kinds of tricks as to how to make a nice straight fence line. Let's say you put a post where one corner of the fence was going to go, and then you went to the other side of the field and you set a post where the other corner will be. So you've got these two corner posts across the field from each other. How will you make a straight line of posts from one to the other? How will you make a straight line of posts? It's very hard to make a straight line. What some people do is they say, okay, well, I'll tie a string from post to post, and then I'll put all the posts along that string, and the string will be my line. Well, go ahead and try that. And what you'll find is that your posts will end up all over the place. The string will move around. The post will vary a little bit. And then when you stand at the end of the fence line and look, you'll see that they go in and out all down the fence line, and it looks terrible. But there's another way to do it, and it's to stand outside the fence line and to look from one post to the other, and then have someone else take another post and place it in line with those posts as you eye that line that connects them, and set that post so that it's in line with the two corner posts. Just using your eyes. No string, no rulers, no fancy measurements, no complex geometry needed. Just stand at the end of the fence line, step back away from the nearer corner post, and look through that corner post to the far corner post, and set the intermediate posts in line as you eye them up from the edge. And you'll find that you can make a perfectly straight fence line by simply keeping your eyes on the two corner posts and lining everything up in between them along the fence line. And this is how the ministers of the church should be in our sight. We have the Pope as the distant corner post. We can consider our bishop as the other corner post, or we can even say it's Christ as the far corner post, and the Pope is the near corner post, and all of the other ministers need to be in that line. And we'll find that they often are aligned. Sometimes we're not standing where we should be standing, and it causes things to look screwy. If we don't stand in the fence line, it'll look like the Pope isn't aligned with Jesus, but that's because we're not in the fence line. If we get ourselves aligned so that Jesus and the Pope in our understanding are aligned, we'll see that much of what exists in the Church is actually in alignment. If we allow some intermediate minister, some priest, or even a bishop to lead us away from that fence line, things will really get screwy. The Pope will even appear to be an enemy of Christ. And many people, I shouldn't say many, because really it's very few people, but they make a lot of noise. Some Catholics, a small number of people who identify as Catholics, have no problem bad-mouthing the Pope himself, which is insane. But this is what happens when we allow other things to become our main thing. And we forget that Christ established a church. He established Peter as the head of the church and ordered the other apostles to align with Peter. And that line of popes and bishops has continued through history as one perfectly straight line and continues as such today. And we need to make sure that we keep ourselves where we belong as Catholic laymen so that we can see things straightly and not allow ourselves to get out of line, because once we get out of line, our opinion of things, our perspective will cause everything to look screwy. And in fact, we're the ones who are out of line. So take this situation with Frank Pavone as a warning. And remember St. Paul's words where he said, "Let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." We're often in the most danger when we think we're most safe. Let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. I hope that's helpful. God bless.